The morning Elara Voss discovered her father's debt, she was standing in the middle of a Kansas wheat field in the autumn of 1878, her boots wet with dew and her heart cracking open like dry earth after a long drought. She had found the letter tucked beneath the floorboard her father always said held his important things, and she had read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They did not. The bank in Dodge City was owed $420, a sum so enormous it might as well have been 4,000. Her father, Harold Voss, had borrowed against the farm 2 seasons ago when the crop failed, and then again the following spring when a late frost took half the young wheat. He had never told her. He had died of a fever in July without telling her, and now the bank had sent its final notice, and Elara was 23 years old and completely, terrifyingly alone. She folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, and looked out across the field her grandfather had broken from raw prairie with nothing but a plow and sheer stubbornness. The wheat stood about knee-high and pale green and trembling in the early wind, and beyond it the cottonwood trees along Cimarron Creek glittered like scattered coins in the light. She had grown up watching that light. She had pressed her face into that soil as a child. She had buried her mother here, and then her father, and the thought of losing this land felt less like losing property and more like losing herself. $420. She had $63 in a tin behind the kitchen stove. She had 3 milk cows, 2 draft horses, a small flock of chickens, and 18 acres of wheat that would not be ready to harvest for another 6 weeks. The bank's deadline was 30 days away. She walked back to the house, sat at the kitchen table and began to think. The neighboring property to the east, separated from hers by a low split-rail fence and a line of scrubby cedars, had stood empty for the better part of a year. The man who had owned it, a rancher named Cooper, had sold off his cattle and moved south to Texas, and the place had sat quiet ever since. But sometime in the past few weeks, she had noticed smoke rising from the chimney of the old Cooper cabin, and a horse in the corral she had never seen before. A truly remarkable horse. Even from a distance, standing at her own fence line, she could tell it was extraordinary. A palomino stallion, tall and clean-limbed, with a coat the color of new honey and a mane so pale it was almost white. She had stood and watched it move in the mornings, the way it floated across the corral with a kind of effortless elegance, and she had thought that whoever owned that horse was either very wealthy or very lucky or both. She had not yet met the new occupant of the Cooper place. That changed on the morning of October the 3rd, 1878, when she went out to repair the fence line between her property and the old Cooper land, and found a man already there, working from the other side. He was crouched down, replacing a rotted rail, and she almost walked right into him before she saw him. He stood up when he heard her boots in the dry grass, and he was tall, taller than she expected, with dark hair pushed back under a battered hat the color of tobacco. He had a lean face, weathered in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors are weathered, with sun-creased lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw covered in a few days of dark stubble. He was perhaps 27 or 28, she thought, though it was difficult to tell. His eyes were a quiet, attentive gray. He held a fence rail in both hands, and he looked at her without speaking for a moment. "I was going to fix this," she said, because she felt the need to say something. "So was I," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste itself. "I am Elara Voss," she said. "The property on this side belongs to me." "Cole Harding," he said. He set the rail down and touched the brim of his hat. "I am renting the Cooper place. Just moved in about 3 weeks ago." "I noticed," she said, and she felt heat touch her cheeks because she had not intended to admit that she had been watching his property. He noticed, she thought. The corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile but was not quite committed to being one. "Smoke from the chimney," he said, offering her a graceful way out of the admission. "Yes," she agreed. They regarded each other across the fence for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of turned earth and dried grass, and somewhere, faintly, wood smoke. "I will fix it from my side if you fix it from yours," he said. "That seems fair," she said. They worked alongside each other for the better part of an hour, separated by the line of cedar posts, close enough to hand tools back and forth when needed, which they did twice, both times with a brief "thank you" from her and a brief nod from him. He was not unfriendly. He was simply quiet in a way she found unusual. Most men she had met in this part of Kansas talked constantly when they were around women, filling silence as though silence were a form of rudeness. Cole Harding seemed entirely comfortable in it. When the fence was repaired, he gathered his tools and she gathered hers, and he looked at the repaired section with a critical eye and gave a small nod of approval. "Good work," he said, and she could not tell if he was talking to her or to himself, but it did not matter because it was true either way. She walked back to her house thinking about gray eyes and the quality of silence between strangers. Over the following 2 weeks, Elara saw Cole Harding with reasonable regularity, as was natural when two people worked neighboring properties. She saw him in the mornings checking his fence line, in the afternoons working on the Cooper cabin roof, which apparently had needed extensive repair. She saw him at the feed store in the nearby town of Millbridge, which was really too small to be called a town, but had a post office and a general store and a blacksmith, which was enough for most purposes. He always nodded. She always nodded back. Once he helped her load 2 heavy sacks of cornmeal into her wagon without being asked, and when she thanked him he said, "Of course," and went back to his own business. She learned small things about him through observation and through the loose, comfortable gossip that traveled through a small farming community like Millbridge. He had come from Missouri. He had worked cattle drives on the Kishom Trail for several years before apparently deciding to try his hand at farming, which she found interesting since he seemed like a man suited to open spaces rather than fixed ones. He was unmarried. He had no apparent family in the area. He was quiet, reliable, paid his bills promptly, and according to the general store owner's wife, Agnes Pell, was about as talkative as a fence post but twice as useful. His horse, the palomino stallion she had admired from her fence line, was named Sundance. She heard him call the horse by name once when she was passing near his corral, his voice dropping into something softer than she had yet heard from him. "Easy, Sundance," he said, and the horse turned its great golden head and pushed its nose against his shoulder. She thought that a man who spoke gently to his horse was probably a man worth knowing. She was also, through all of this, growing increasingly desperate about the bank debt. She had written 3 letters and received 3 responses, each one more formal and less sympathetic than the last. The bank, a Dodge City institution called First Territorial Savings, was not in the business of sentiment. 30 days had become 20, and 20 had become 15. And she was running out of ideas and running out of time with a speed that kept her awake at night listening to the wind work its way under the eaves of the house her grandfather built. She had tried selling the draft horses, but the price offered was insultingly low. She had sold 2 of her milk cows and gotten $60, which brought her total savings to $123. She needed $420. She was still nearly $300 short with no visible way to close the gap. She had considered asking the banker, a smooth-faced man named Archibald Dexter, for an extension. She had gone to Dodge City for that purpose 10 days ago, making the 30-mile journey in her wagon over 2 days, staying at a boarding house overnight. Dexter had received her politely and offered her a chair in his wood-paneled office, and listened to her situation with an expression of practiced sympathy. Then he had told her that the bank's policy did not allow for extensions beyond the notice period, and that if the debt was not satisfied by November the 2nd, the bank would take possession of the property and liquidate it to recover the loan. He had said liquidate the way some people say good morning, without particular feeling, as though land and the lives built on it were simply items on a ledger. She had driven home in cold fury and gone out to the field and stood among her grandfather's wheat and talked to him out loud, which she had done periodically since childhood and which she found consistently helpful, and she had told him she was not going to let this happen without fighting every inch of the way. It was on a Thursday evening, 11 days before the deadline, that she found herself standing at Cole Harding's fence line in the last gray light of the day. She had not planned it. She had been walking the property, as she did most evenings, doing a kind of accounting with her eyes of what she had and what it meant. She had come to the east fence line and looked across and seen the palomino moving in the corral in the fading light, its coat catching the last color of sunset, burning gold and copper against the dark of the coming night. And she had known, with a clarity that came from desperation meeting possibility in the same moment, what that horse was worth. A palomino stallion of that quality, in that condition, in Kansas in 1878, could easily fetch $300, perhaps more. She had heard stories of fine horses bringing $400 at auction in Dodge City. She stood at the fence and felt immediately ashamed of the direction of her thoughts. She did not know Cole Harding well. She had no right to covet his property. She had no plan, no proposal, no angle of approach that did not feel like either charity-seeking or manipulation. But she stood there anyway, watching Sundance move in the dusk, because she did not have the luxury of pride. She was still standing there when the door of the cabin opened and Cole came out, and he stopped when he saw her at the fence and then walked over. "Elara," he said. "Cole," she said. He stood on his side of the fence and looked at her in the fading light, and she thought he was reading her the way men who spend time alone learn to read the things that other people have stopped saying out loud. He waited. "I am going to lose my farm," she said, because there was no point in anything but the direct path. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She told him about the letters, about the bank in Dodge City, about the $420 and the 30-day notice and the 11 days she had left. She told him about selling the cows and the failed attempts to negotiate an extension. She told him about the wheat that was not yet ready and would not save her in time even if it came in perfectly. She told him about her grandfather and the field, and how this land was not just land to her, but was the thing her family had shaped their lives around for 40 years. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his arms resting on the top rail of the fence, his eyes on her face. When she stopped talking, the silence between them was full of the sound of the wind and the creek and somewhere distant a coyote beginning its evening complaint. "I am not asking you for anything," she said quickly, because she heard in the silence something that felt too much like pity and she could not bear it. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone." "All right," he said. "I am going to find a way," she said, with more certainty than she felt. "All right," he said again. She went home. She did not sleep well that night. The following morning, she made a list of every possible option, and one by one she found reasons why each one fell short. She could take in laundry and mending, as she had been doing at a small scale already, but the income was too slow. She could sell more livestock, but she had already sold what she could spare, and the remaining animals were necessary for the farm's operation. She could write to her father's brother in Pennsylvania, but he had 3 children and a modest income of his own, and she had not seen him in 12 years and could not ask him to shoulder her burden. She could apply for a loan from a different bank, but a woman alone without a husband's signature would find that road closed before it started. She was on her 3rd cup of coffee and her 2nd page of crossed-out options when she heard a horse in her yard. She went to the window and saw Cole Harding stepping down from a brown quarter horse she had seen him ride before, not Sundance. She noticed the quarter horse, which she did not attach any meaning to at the time. She opened the door before he knocked. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He held his hat in both hands, which she had never seen him do before. "I wonder if I could trouble you for a cup of that coffee I can smell from your yard." "Of course," she said, and stepped back to let him in. She poured him a cup and he sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had read the bank's letter 5 times, and he looked at the list of crossed-out options she had left there. He did not reach for it or ask about it, but she could see his eyes register it, and she did not try to hide it. He drank his coffee. She sat across from him. "I was thinking," he said finally, "about your situation." "I told you I am not asking for anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I am offering, which is a different thing." She looked at him carefully. His gray eyes were steady. "I have a bit of money saved," he said, "enough to cover what you need." The offer hit her like cold water, and she felt the heat of it behind her eyes, and she would not cry in front of this near stranger, so she pressed her lips together and looked at the window until the feeling passed. "No," she said. "Why not?" His tone was not offended. It was simply curious. "Because you do not know me well enough to make that kind of offer," she said. "And because I will not owe a debt of that size to a neighbor I have known for 3 weeks. It would be a loan," he said. "Terms to be decided between us." "Answer is still no," she said, though it cost her something to say it. He nodded as though he had expected this and finished his coffee and set the cup down with care. "Then let me suggest something else," he said. "I know a thing or two about wheat. I have worked farms before. Let me help you with the harvest when it comes in. Working together, we could get it in faster and you would have the money from the crop sooner." "The harvest won't be ready in time," she said. "The deadline is November the 2nd. The wheat won't be ready before mid-November." He looked at that for a moment. "Then we need to find the money another way in the next 11 days. She said. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was careful and deliberate, like a man choosing the exact right words for a thing that mattered. "If you will allow it," he said. She thought about saying no. She thought about pride and self-sufficiency and the clear, hard lesson her father had tried to teach her about not depending on others. Then she thought about her grandfather's field and the way the wheat moved in the morning wind. "All right," she said. He spent the better part of that day, and the next 3 days helping her think through possibilities. He knew people she did not know, had connections from his years on the cattle drives. He wrote 2 letters himself to men in Dodge City who dealt in livestock, asking about prices for a pair of draft horses, and the responses were better than what she had been offered locally. They organized a sale of the draft horses at a price that, combined with her savings, brought her total to $185, still more than 200 short. On the 6th day before the deadline, Cole rode into Millbridge and was gone most of the afternoon. She did not ask him where he had gone when he returned in the early evening, his hat low against the last of the day's light. He came to her door and knocked, and she opened it. "I have some news," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood in the kitchen, and there was something different about him, she thought. Something restrained, like a man holding himself very still around the edges of a feeling. "I found a buyer," he said, "for enough to cover your remaining debt." She stared at him. "What buyer? For what?" "For Sundance," he said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. "You cannot sell your horse," she said finally. "I can do what I like with my own property," he said, and his tone was quiet but firm, without any room in it for argument. "Cole." She said his name the way you say the name of someone who is about to do something you cannot stop but cannot watch. "That horse is your prize animal. I have seen the way you are with him. You cannot sell Sundance to cover my debt." "I did not ask for your opinion on the matter," he said, not unkindly. "I am giving it anyway," she said. "I will not allow it." "Elara," he looked at her directly. "You are going to lose your farm in 6 days if we do not find the money. I have found the money. The conversation is fairly simple." "It is not simple," she said, and her voice cracked at the edge of the word, and she hated it. "You have known me for 3 weeks. That horse is worth more to you than—" "I am not asking you to agree with me," he said. "I am telling you what I have decided." She looked at him for a long moment, at this quiet, careful man standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and the lines of the sunset fading through the window behind him. "Why?" she asked, and the word was soft and genuine. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the floor, then back up at her, and his expression was not one she could read easily. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. It was not the whole answer. She knew it was not the whole answer. But she also knew, from the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes, that it was all the answer she was going to get tonight. The buyer was a rancher from Wichita who had been looking for a quality palomino stallion for breeding purposes. Cole had ridden to Millbridge and sent a telegram, and the man had replied within 2 hours with an offer of $350. Cole had agreed without negotiating further, which was the one detail of the transaction that later made Elara go quiet in a way she did not immediately understand. On the morning of October the 27th, 1878, Cole Harding led Sundance out of his corral for the last time. Elara watched from her side of the fence. She had not planned to watch. She had been intending to go inside and let him have his privacy with it. But she found her feet would not cooperate, and she stood at the fence line and she watched. He had the palomino's lead in one hand, and he walked the horse in a slow circle around the corral before bringing him to the gate. He stopped there, and he put both hands on the horse's face, the way you hold something you are saying goodbye to, and he pressed his forehead against the horse's nose for a long moment and said something she could not hear. Then he straightened, and he opened the gate, and he walked Sundance down the lane to where the Wichita rancher's man was waiting with a stock trailer hitched to a wagon. She had to turn away. She went inside and stood at her kitchen window and looked out at nothing, and she felt something happening in her chest that she could not name and was not sure she was ready for. The total of the money, the sale of Sundance plus what she had already accumulated, came to $535, which meant that after paying the bank's $420 she would have $115 remaining, enough to replace the draft horses she had sold and carry her through the winter. Cole brought her the money from Sundance's sale that same afternoon in an envelope that he handed to her at her door. She took it with both hands. "Thank you," she said, and the 2 words were entirely inadequate for what they needed to carry, but she said them as fully as she could. He nodded. "I will pay you back," she said, "when the wheat comes in." He started to shake his head. "Cole," she said his name and held his gaze, "I mean it. I will pay you back." Something shifted in his expression, an acceptance, perhaps, of the fact that she needed to say this not for his benefit but for her own. "When the wheat comes in," he said. She made the trip to Dodge City alone, leaving before dawn on October the 29th and arriving the following morning, and she walked into First Territorial Savings Bank and placed $420 in front of Archibald Dexter, and watched his smooth face rearrange itself around the reality that he would not be taking her family's land that week. She received a receipt and a release of lien, and she folded both documents with great care and placed them in the inner pocket of her coat, and she walked out into the bright October street and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and felt the weight lift. She drove home in 2 days and arrived on the evening of November the 1st, the day before the original deadline, and she came in tired and trail-dusty, and she went to the east fence line before she went inside her house. The corral next door was empty. She stood there for a moment, looking at the space where Sundance used to be, and she felt the absence of that horse as a kind of second grief layered over the first. She went in and washed her face and ate something cold from the larder and went to bed. Over the following days, the natural rhythm of autumn farm life reasserted itself. The wheat continued its slow progress toward harvest. The mornings grew colder, frost appearing on the inside of her window glass some nights, and she began thinking ahead to the work of bringing in the crop and getting through the winter. Cole continued his work on the Cooper place, which she could see from her window had improved considerably since he had taken up residence there. The roof was sound now, the fences all repaired, the yard organized in the way of someone who planned to stay. They saw each other most days. Their interactions had changed since the sale of Sundance, had taken on a quality she could not precisely define. There was more ease between them, the ease of people who had been through something real together, and also something careful, a kind of mutual attention that was more than neighborly but had not yet declared itself as anything beyond that. He came to help with small things unbidden. When her kitchen stovepipe developed a leak and she was up on the roof trying to fix it, She looked down to find him in her yard looking up at her with an expression of mild concern, and he climbed up and had it fixed in 20 minutes. When her remaining milk cow got herself tangled in the wire along the west fence, he appeared almost immediately after she called out for help, and they worked together in the cold gray morning to free the animal without injuring her. She brought him food. She did not precisely decide to do this, it simply started happening. She made too much stew and brought him a pot of it. She baked bread and left a loaf at his door. He never mentioned it, never made a fuss, but the pot was always returned clean, and once she found it with a note inside that said only "Thank you," in a handwriting that was plain and careful. "You are being very kind to him," Agnes Pell observed one afternoon at the general store, with the particular tone of a woman who is commenting on something specific while pretending to comment on something general. "He helped me when I needed help," Elara said. "He did more than help," Agnes said. "The whole town knows he sold that horse of his. Wouldn't say why to anyone who asked, either. Just said he had his reasons." Elara paid for her flour and her coffee beans and did not say anything more. That evening, sitting by the stove with a cup of tea, she thought about the phrase Agnes had used. Wouldn't say why to anyone who asked. She had noticed this herself, that he had not sought any recognition for what he had done, had not used it as currency with her or with anyone else in the community. He had simply done it and then continued being the same quiet, steady man he had been before. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the way he had pressed his forehead against Sundance's nose before loading the horse, the private quality of that moment, and she thought about his hands on the fence rail and his gray eyes in the evening light. And she thought about all the small ways she had found herself looking for him in the course of a day without consciously deciding to. She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the wind and felt something warm and frightening opening up inside her like a field after rain. The wheat harvest came in during the 3rd week of November. Cole was there every day of it, working alongside her from first light to last, and the crop came in well, better than she had dared hope given the season's rough beginning. The yield was strong and the price at market was fair, and when she sat at her kitchen table on the evening of the 4th day of harvest and added the numbers, she had enough to replace her draft horses and stock the larder and carry the farm comfortably through the winter. And she had enough to repay Cole Harding every dollar she owed him. She counted out the money carefully and wrapped it and wrote his name on the outside, and the next morning she walked to his door and knocked. He opened it with a coffee cup in his hand and the look of a man who had been up for a while. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She held out the wrapped money. "This is what I owe you," she said, "with interest calculated at the bank rate for the period." He looked at the money in her hand. He looked at her face. He took the money and stood there with it, and something crossed his expression that she could not read. "You did not have to add interest," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to," he nodded slowly. "Elara," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "I wonder," he said very carefully, "whether you might have dinner with me sometime, not as a neighbor, something different from that." She looked at him standing in his doorway with the coffee cup in one hand and the wrapped money in the other, this quiet, serious man who had given up something precious for her without asking anything in return and without making any claim on it afterward. "Yes," she said. "I think I would like that." The smile that crossed his face then was different from anything she had seen from him before. It was unguarded and genuine, and it changed his whole face, loosened something that was usually held very carefully in place. "Friday evening," he said. "Friday evening," she agreed. She went home and stood in her kitchen and put both hands flat on the table and breathed in and breathed out, and the feeling inside her was so large and so unfamiliar that she almost did not recognize it, but she was honest enough with herself to call it by its right name. He cooked for her. She had not expected this, and it surprised her. The fact of a man who could produce a proper meal with apparent ease and satisfaction. He had made a beef stew with root vegetables and cornbread, and there was apple preserves and strong coffee, and the Cooper cabin, which she had never been inside before, was clean and spare and organized in the way of someone who thought carefully about how to live. They ate at his kitchen table and they talked, really talked, for the first time. Not about practicalities or fence lines or crop prices, but about their actual lives and how they had come to be the people they were. He told her about growing up on his family's farm in Missouri, the third of 4 sons, and about his years on the cattle drives, and about the particular way that life on the trail, moving constantly and sleeping under open sky, had eventually made him want the opposite, a fixed place, a piece of ground to know deeply. She told him about her grandfather, who had broken the original Voss land from raw prairie in 1841, and about her mother, who had died when Elara was 12, and about her father, who had been a good man and a hard worker but had been too proud to ask for help when the crops failed, and had let his silence become the thing that nearly destroyed what he loved most. Cole listened to this last part with particular attention. "I understand that kind of pride," he said, "the kind that costs you more than you can afford." "Yes," she said, "though I think there is a difference between destructive pride and genuine self-reliance." "There is," he agreed. "The difference is whether the pride serves you or whether you serve it." She looked at him across the table and thought that this was an unusually clear-eyed thing to say. "You are not much like I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" she considered. "Someone quieter," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, short and warm, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh and she felt it somewhere between her ribs. "I am fairly quiet," he said. "You are," she agreed. "But there is a great deal of thinking happening behind the quiet." "Is that a complaint?" he said, and his eyes were warm. "No," she said. "I find it restful." "Good," he said, and the word was soft and had several layers to it. They sat after dinner in chairs near the stove with their coffee and the lamp burning warm yellow, and they talked for another 2 hours. And when she finally said she should go home, he walked her to the fence line and they stood there in the cold, clear night with the stars overhead so close and numerous that the sky felt populated. "Thank you," she said. "It was a very good evening." "It was," he said. "Cole." She said his name and he looked at her. "I want to say something about Sundance." His expression shifted, became carefully neutral in the way she had come to recognize as his way of receiving things that mattered. "I know you do not want to discuss it," she said. "And I know you will not make any more of it than you have, but I want you to know that I understand what you did and what it cost you, and I do not take it lightly, not any of it." He was quiet for a moment. "The farm is worth saving," he said. "Some things are." "Yes," she said, "they are." They stood there in the starlight for another moment, close enough to the fence that if either of them had reached out they would have reached the other. She did not reach out, neither did he. But the space between them felt inhabited in a new way, like a room where someone had just lit a fire. She went home across the frost-stiff grass and did not look back, but she was smiling. The winter of 1878 to 1879 settled over the Kansas plains, with the particular severity that plains winters reserve for people who have gotten comfortable. The snow came in early December and came in earnest, and the temperature dropped to levels that made the air sharp as a knife and turned the bare cottonwoods into ice sculptures along the creek. Elara was prepared for it. Her larder was stocked, her wood was cut and stacked, and her remaining livestock were sheltered and fed. Cole was a constant during those months. He came over most mornings to help with the heavy work of winter farm maintenance, the carrying of water when the well pump froze, the digging out after the storms, the extra cutting of firewood that the brutal cold demanded. She went to his place in the evenings, usually 3 or 4 times a week, and they ate together and talked beside his stove or beside hers, and the story of each other filled itself in gradually, the way country fills in around a traveler who moves slowly enough to see it properly. She learned that he had a deep knowledge of horses that went beyond what you would expect even from a man who had worked cattle drives. He knew their bones and their blood and their habits and their language, the language of ears and skin and shifting weight. He had trained horses since he was a boy, and it was the thing he loved most in the world to do. She thought about Sundance again, about the knowledge of what that loss had actually meant to him, and she felt a tenderness so acute it was almost physical. He learned about her that she had a gift for growing things, that her hands in soil produced results that other people's hands did not, that she knew her land the way some people know music, by feel and by intuition, and by a kind of love that expressed itself as attention. He watched her with the wheat and with her kitchen garden, and he told her once very quietly that he had never seen anyone move through a field the way she did, as if she belonged to it. "My grandfather used to say the land belongs to no one," she said. "It only lends itself." He was right, Cole said. He also used to say that the only honest thing a person can do is take good care of whatever the land lends them, she said. Also right, Cole said, for land and for most other things. She had looked at him when he said this, at the angle of his jaw and the particular quality of his attention, and she had felt the feeling in her chest sharpen into something she had no more uncertainty about. In January, on a night when the temperature had dropped below anything Elara had ever personally experienced, and the wind was shaking the walls of her house, she woke in the deep night to the sound of something wrong. She lay still and listened, and then she heard it clearly. One of her milk cows in obvious distress, the kind of distress that meant the animal was down or injured or in labor at the worst possible time. She dressed in every layer she owned and lit her lantern and went out into the dark and the cold, and the wind nearly took her off her feet in the yard. She found the cow in the corner of the shelter, lying on her side, her eyes rolling, beginning to labor with a calf that was presenting wrong. Elara had assisted with difficult births before, but this position was beyond what she could manage alone. She ran back to the house and got her coat and her lantern, and she ran to Cole's cabin and pounded on the door, which she had never done before regardless of the hour. He opened it in 30 seconds, already half-dressed, with the immediate alertness of a man who is used to emergencies. "The cow," she said, "breech birth. I cannot manage it alone." He pulled on his coat and his boots without a word and came. They worked together in the cold shelter for nearly 2 hours, both of them on their knees in the straw, their breath making clouds in the lantern light, talking the whole time in the quiet, focused way of people doing difficult work together. He knew what to do, knew it in his hands the way she had expected he would, and between them they turned the calf and brought it safely out into the cold world, and the mother lay there afterward, panting and exhausted but whole. The calf was a bull, dark brown and wet and perfect, and he stood on shaking legs within an hour and found his mother and the shelter filled with the sounds of new life. They sat on the straw floor of the shelter afterward, their backs against the wall, both of them too tired to move immediately. The lantern threw warm gold across them. Outside, the wind was still working at the walls. "Thank you," she said. "I would have lost them both without you." "You might have managed," he said. "I would not have," she said honestly. He turned his head and looked at her. Their faces were close in the warm circle of the lamplight. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes and the dark stubble along his jaw and the particular gray of his eyes that she had come to know as one of the most familiar things in her world. "Elara," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not quite the response to what he had said, but it was the response to what she could see in his eyes, which was asking something different and larger and with more permanence in it. He reached out and touched her face with one hand, his fingers cold from the night work but careful, and she leaned into the touch and he kissed her, gently at first and then more fully, and it was exactly as she had known it would be, warm and honest and unhurried. The calf moved in the straw nearby and the wind rattled the shelter walls and the lantern burned steadily. When they stopped and looked at each other, neither of them spoke for a moment, and then she laughed, a real laughing sound that came from somewhere loose and delighted. "In a cattle shelter in the middle of January," she said. "There are worse places," he said, and he was smiling, the full unguarded smile she had first seen on the morning she agreed to dinner. "No," she agreed. "There are not worse places at all." He walked her back to her house through the diminishing wind, and at her door he held her hand and said, "Get some sleep," and she said, "You too." And she went inside with her lantern and the warmth of it and the warmth of him, and she sat in her chair and held both to herself for a long time before she slept. The winter deepened and then slowly, reluctantly, began to give ground to spring, and with the spring came the natural opening of the world that has always been one of the great quiet miracles of farming country. The cottonwoods along Cimarron Creek leafed out in a pale, trembling green. The first of the meadowlarks arrived and set up their territories along the fence lines. The soil turned dark and ready under the cold blue skies of March, and Elara began to prepare for spring planting with the particular eager energy she brought to the beginning of every new growing season. Cole was with her through all of it, and they were together now in a way that the community of Millbridge had noted with the particular approving warmth that small communities extend to two people who clearly belong together and have finally acknowledged it. Agnes Pell said it made her feel young again just to look at them. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Henry Two Bears, who was half Osage and half Irish and had lived near Millbridge for 20 years, shook Cole's hand one morning and said simply, "She is a good woman. You are fortunate," and Cole had said, equally simply, "I know it." In April, Cole had what he described to Elara as a piece of news. He told her about it on a Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the porch of the Voss farmhouse, the warmth of the spring sun making the afternoon feel like a gift after the long winter. He had a cup of coffee and she had her tea, and the new calf was visible in the pasture, grown into a strong young animal with no memory of his difficult entrance into the world. "I have been in contact with a horse breeder in Wichita," Cole said. "A man I met on the trail years ago. He has a young mare he wants to sell, a quarter horse, filly, well-bred, quiet disposition. He is asking $40. She looked at him. "I cannot replace Sundance," he said. "There is no replacing him." "But I can start again." "You should have another horse," she said. "I think so," he said. He was looking out at the field rather than at her. "I have been thinking about it for a while. And I have been thinking about some other things as well." "What kind of things?" she said. He turned and looked at her. There was the careful quality in his face again, the man choosing his words quality, but underneath it was something very direct and clear. "I have been thinking about whether I should ask you to marry me," he said. She set down her tea. "And have you reached a conclusion?" she said, keeping her voice steady, though her heart was doing something irregular and wonderful. "I have," he said. "The conclusion is that I should, and that I want to, and that the question is whether you would want that too. I am not a man with a great deal to offer in terms of material circumstances. The Cooper place is rented, and the money I have saved is modest, and I have no property of my own. But I am a reliable man, and I intend to stay in one place, and I love you, and I think I would be a good partner to you in all the ways that matter." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fence rail and the sale of Sundance and the quiet nights by the stove and the calf born in January, and every morning and every evening that had brought her here to this moment on this porch in this April light. "Cole Harding," she said, "you traded your prize horse to keep my farm, and you never said a word about it to anyone except that you had your reasons. You are the most decent man I have ever met in my life." His expression did something complicated. "I also happen to be deeply in love with you," she continued. "So yes, the answer is yes." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb moving across her knuckles with the same care with which he did everything, and he said her name, just her name, and it sounded like everything. They were married in June 1879 at the Millbridge Church, a small clapboard building that smelled of wood and candle wax and the particular combination of perfume and mud that characterized its congregation. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister, a cheerful, red-faced man named Reverend Potts, who seemed genuinely delighted by every wedding he conducted, as though each one were the first. Agnes Pell attended with her husband and wept productively from the second row. Henry Two Bears attended in his best coat and stood very straight and looked very pleased. A handful of other Millbridge neighbors filled the remaining pews. Elara wore her mother's dress, which she had taken in slightly at the waist and let out at the hem, and she carried a bundle of wildflowers from the creek bank, the yellow and blue and white ones that had been her mother's favorites. Cole wore a suit that he had evidently acquired in Dodge City, dark and clean and perfectly fitting, and when he turned from the altar and saw her coming down the aisle, his expression was not the expression of a composed man. She saw his throat move. She saw his eyes. She walked to him and they stood together and made their promises in front of the small community that had become, she realized, their community in every real sense. And when it was done, they stepped out into the June light, and she thought she had never been more certain of anything in her life. The reception was held in the yard of the Voss farm, which was now their farm, and people brought food and someone brought a fiddle, and the afternoon dissolved into warmth and music, and the long June light over the wheat fields. Cole brought home the quarter-horse filly that month, the one he had been in contact with the Wichita breeder about. He named her Prairie, a simple name that suited her plain, honest character. She was a good horse, sound and willing and smart, and he worked with her every morning in the early light, and Elara watched from the porch sometimes with her coffee, watching him move around the young horse with the ease and patience that were his particular gifts, and she felt a contentment so complete it was almost difficult to hold. She also, without making any announcement about it, began quietly saving against the purchase of a proper stallion for Cole. She kept a separate tin for this purpose, adding to it from the farm's income through the summer and fall of 1879 and into the following year. She had not discussed this plan with anyone, had not told Cole, and it was perhaps the one secret she kept from him through the first year of their marriage, which was otherwise entirely transparent. The farm flourished in 1879. The wheat came in strong, a full and generous harvest that rewarded all the care she had put into the fields, and between the crop income and the small herd of cattle Cole had begun building on the south portion of the property, using the land that had been underutilized in her father's last years. The farm was doing better than it had since her grandfather's time. Cole had negotiated the purchase of the Cooper property from its absent owner, who had been glad to be rid of it for a fair price, and they had incorporated it into the Voss farm, renaming the whole thing the Harding farm and meaning to keep it, which was the only intention either of them had ever had. She discovered in October of 1879 that she was expecting their first child. She told Cole on a Thursday morning while they were eating breakfast, setting her fork down and saying, "I have something to tell you." And when she told him, his face went through several things in rapid sequence, surprise and then a radiant, helpless happiness that she had never seen on anyone's face before in quite that way. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hand, and he said nothing because he was apparently temporarily unable to say anything. "Cole," she said, and laughed. "I am just," he said. "I am." "I know," she said. He pressed his lips to her hand, and she put her free hand on his hair, and they stayed like that for a moment in the morning kitchen while the stove ticked, and the October light came through the window, and the world was enormous and close at the same time. Their son was born in June of 1880, a healthy and loud boy whom they named Harold James Harding, for Elara's father, and for no other reason than that the name seemed to want to belong to him. He was dark-haired like his father, and had his mother's stubbornness from the first week of his life, which was evident from the determined, focused way he approached eating. Cole was with her through the labor, which was a long one, and when Harold was finally placed in his arms, Cole sat in the chair beside her bed and held his son and looked at him with an expression that was so concentrated and so full that Elara could not look at it for very long without something behind her eyes going warm and wet. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like both of us," Cole said. "He has your jaw." "No, he does not," she said. "He absolutely does," he said, and looked up at her with the full, unguarded smile. "He is going to be very stubborn." "He is going to be wonderful," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. She laughed and was immediately annoyed that laughing was uncomfortable, and told him so, and he smiled, and handed her their son, and she held Harold James Harding in the early morning light, and thought about her grandfather and her father and the field outside, and all the generations of people who had made this moment possible. And she thought that the land does indeed only lend itself, and you take good care of what you are lent, and you do not waste a single day of it. In the spring of 1881, on a bright March morning with the cottonwoods just beginning to show their first green, Elara told Cole to close his eyes and come out to the barn. He looked at her with mild suspicion. "Trust me," she said. "I always trust you," he said. "That does not mean I am not suspicious." She took his hand and led him through the yard to the barn door and opened it and said, "All right." He opened his eyes. In the third stall, his head over the rail with the patient look of a horse who has been traveling and is ready to be still, was a palomino stallion, not Sundance. He was broader through the chest and darker in the coat, more copper than gold, but he was the same type, the same quality, the same extraordinary presence that made you stop when you saw it. Cole stood very still. She had saved for 16 months and found the horse through the same Wichita breeder who had Prairie, and she had arranged the purchase and the transport without telling him, and she had nearly lost her composure 3 times in the final days of waiting when she thought he might figure out what she was doing. "His name," she said, "is whatever you want it to be. He is yours. I bought him with the money I saved from last year's harvest." Cole did not say anything for a long moment. He walked forward slowly and let the stallion smell his hand, and the horse took his scent calmly, and then pushed his nose against Cole's shoulder in the specific way of horses who decide immediately that a person is all right. Cole put his hand on the horse's neck and stood there with his back to her, and she could see from the angle of his shoulders and the particular stillness of him that he was dealing with something very large and was doing it quietly, which was his way. After a moment he turned around. His eyes were bright and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. "Elara," he said, "you gave up the thing you loved most for my family's farm," she said. "And you never said a single word about it, not one word, so I wanted to give you something back." He crossed the space between them and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt him hold her with the full measure of everything he did not usually say out loud. "You did not have to," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I wanted to. There is a difference." She felt him smile against the top of her head. "What will you name him?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Prairie Gold," he said, "for the color and for the fact that this is where I intend to be for the rest of my life." "Prairie Gold," she said, tasting the name. "That is perfect." "Like most things that grow here," he said. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret, came into the world in November of 1882, a winter baby like her father had been, arriving on a night of light snow with the stars outside the window and the quiet certainty of a child who has no doubts about her welcome. She was smaller than Harold had been and louder about everything, and she had her father's gray eyes, which in her face looked luminous and considering. Harold, who was 2.5, inspected his new sister with the grave seriousness of a small scientist and declared her acceptable, which made Cole laugh so hard he had to leave the room. The Harding farm grew through the early 1880s into something that had a name in the county, a place known for its wheat and its cattle, and increasingly for its horses, because Cole's talent with horses had found its proper venue in the form of Prairie Gold and Prairie, and the small but exceptional string of horses they produced and trained together. He had a reputation now that reached beyond Millbridge and into Dodge City and Wichita, a man who could breed and train horses of unusual quality, and it brought buyers to their door with gratifying regularity. He also found something he had not expected to find, which was that he was good at teaching, that the same patience and attention that made him excellent with horses made him excellent at explaining to other people how to be better with them. He began taking on a student or two each year, young men from neighboring farms who wanted to learn, and he taught them in the same quiet, methodical way he did everything, and he watched them become better than they had been and felt a satisfaction in it that surprised him. Elara watched all of this with the particular pleasure of someone who has seen a person find the full size of themselves. She had known when she met him that there was a great deal happening behind the quiet exterior. She had simply not known the extent of it. They had arguments, of course. They were two strong-willed people managing a farm together, and some things were going to need to be fought out before they could be resolved. She wanted to expand the wheat acreage, and he thought they were already at the productive limit of what they could harvest with their labor and equipment. He wanted to invest in a second stallion sooner than her assessment of the finances suggested was prudent. She kept the farm's books and her analysis was accurate, and they both knew it, which did not stop him from disagreeing, and they had one particularly thorough discussion about it on a Thursday evening in January of 1884 that went on for 2 hours and ended with both of them having made their points with complete honesty and arriving at a compromise that was actually better than either of their individual positions. Afterward, she said, "You are infuriating when you are right." And he said, "You are correct about the finances, and I should have said so sooner." And she said, "You said it eventually. That is enough." And he looked at her with the quiet gray eyes and said, "I never stopped being grateful for you, you know," which made the previous 2 hours of disagreement feel entirely worthwhile. Henry Two Bears, their old friend from Millbridge, fell ill in the spring of 1884, and Cole drove into town every week to help with whatever was needed. And when Henry died in May, quietly and without complaint in his small house near the blacksmith shop, Cole was one of the 4 men who carried him. It was a reminder, as those things always are, of the fragility of the time you have and the importance of the people you spend it with. They attended the funeral together, Elara and Cole, with Harold on her left and Margaret on his right, and the small community gathered around the grave of a man who had lived with integrity in a time and place that had not always been generous to men of his particular combination of bloodlines. Cole spoke at the service, briefly and plainly, saying that Henry Two Bears had been a man who treated everyone the same and asked for nothing he had not earned, and that those were the qualities worth emulating. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, Harold asked his father what it meant to emulate someone, and Cole explained it in simple and accurate terms, and Harold thought about it, and then said he would like to emulate Henry Two Bears when he grew up, and Cole put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said that was an excellent choice. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that was not catastrophic, but was uncomfortable, the kind of dry heat that turned the normally generous Kansas landscape into something tight-lipped and stingy. The wheat suffered some, but the farm's diversified income, the horses and the cattle, provided a cushion that her father never would have had access to, and they came through it without the desperate scrambling that a monoculture farm would have experienced. She thought about her father during that summer, about his silence, about the debts he had kept from her, and she understood him better now than she had before. She understood the pride and the fear, and the way they tangled together into something that looked like protection, but was actually a kind of walls-up isolation. She had come closer to that herself than she liked to admit, that night at Cole's fence line when she had almost not told him what was happening. She was glad she had spoken. She was glad every single day. That fall, she planted a small orchard on the south side of the farm, apple and pear trees that would not produce for years, but that she planted with the understanding of someone who intends to be somewhere for a long time. Cole helped her set the stakes and dig the holes, and Harold helped plant the trees themselves, working with the focused seriousness that had always characterized him, and little Margaret sat on a fence post nearby and gave detailed instructions to no one in particular about how trees should be planted, based on absolutely no information she had not invented herself on the spot. "She is going to be a great deal to manage," Cole said, watching his daughter. "She is going to be extraordinary," Elara said. "Same thing," he said. "Exactly the same thing," she agreed. In the winter of 1885, when Harold was 5 and Margaret was 2, and the farm was humming along with the deep, established rhythm of a well-run enterprise. Cole came in from the barn one evening with a particular look on his face that she had learned to associate with something he had been thinking about for a while and had finally decided to say. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. She was mending by the stove, the lamp burning warm beside her, the children already in bed. He sat across from her and put his hands flat on his knees and looked at her directly. "When I sold Sundance," he said, "I told you I did it because it was the right thing to do." "Yes," she said, and she was quiet and careful because she understood this was a moment that had been waiting for a long time. "That was true," he said, "but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I sold him because by the time I made that decision, I had already fallen in love with you. I had known it for about a week and had not said it to anyone, including myself, in very plain terms. But when I was thinking about what to do about your farm and what I had available that could help, and I thought about selling Sundance, I was not unhappy about it the way I would have been unhappy about it under other circumstances." He paused. "I was relieved. Because it gave me something I could do." She set down her mending. "You had fallen in love with me," she said. "After about 2.5 weeks of knowing you," he said, "which is not a lot of time, I am aware." "It was enough time," she said. "It was," he agreed. She got up and went to him and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. "Why did you not tell me then?" she said. "Because it was not the right time," he said. "And because the most important thing was the farm. And I did not want you to think that the help came with conditions or expectations. I would rather you thought I was simply a decent neighbor than feel obligated to me." She was quiet for a moment. "You are a remarkable person, Cole Harding," she said. "I am a person who was very afraid of making the wrong move with the right person," he said. "Those are different things." "Maybe," she said, "but the result is the same." He kissed her temple. "I just wanted you to know the whole truth of it," he said. "I did not want there to be any part of the story you did not have." She turned and looked at him. At this face she had come to know as completely as she knew her own field, every line and plane of it, every variation of his expression. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for a long time, and I love you more now, and I intend to keep loving you for every year of the rest of my life." He held her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he was, without the careful holding back, without the reserve, simply and fully present. "So do I," he said. "Every single day, so do I. The years pass the way good years do when you are paying attention to them. Not unnoticed but full, each season bringing its particular pleasures and its particular work, and its particular moments of grace." The orchard trees grew, and in the spring of 1889 produced their first apples, small and tart and perfect, and Margaret, who was 6, ate approximately 14 of them in a single afternoon, and was extremely unwell that night, which she maintained was worth it. Harold had his father's way with horses and his mother's relentless curiosity, and by the time he was 9, he could read Prairie Gold's moods as accurately as any adult, and had begun helping Cole with the training of the younger horses in the string. Watching them work together in the morning light, the tall, quiet man and the smaller, serious boy who moved around horses with the same ease and patience, was one of the constants of Elara's life that she found purely and straightforwardly beautiful. Cole had built up the horse operation to the point where they had 6 breeding horses and were producing 8 to 12 animals per year, all of them well-trained and well-regarded in the regional market. He had a relationship now with buyers in Wichita and Dodge City, and had even received 2 inquiries from buyers in Kansas City, which was a remarkable reach for a farm operation that had started with a rented property and a quarter-horse filly. Prairie Gold, the copper gold stallion, was 8 years old in 1889, and at the peak of his powers, an extraordinary animal whose offspring consistently displayed the quality of his bloodline. Cole worked with him every morning, and their relationship had the depth and ease of long partnership. Elara had expanded the farm's wheat acreage by 10 acres in 1887, when they finally had the draft power and the equipment to manage it, and the additional land was productive, and had the year before contributed substantially to the farm's best financial year since its founding. She had also taken on a modest amount of agricultural consulting for 2 neighboring farms whose owners were struggling with soil management, not for significant payment, but because the knowledge she had was useful, and she believed in using useful things. In December of 1889, they sat by the stove on a Sunday evening with Harold doing his reading at the table and Margaret, who had declared reading entirely too quiet, and had fallen asleep in her chair. And Elara looked around the room at these people and this house, and felt a happiness so settled and so complete that it was not the giddy, urgent kind but the other kind, the deep and certain kind, the kind that does not rush because it knows it belongs where it is. She looked at Cole, who was watching the fire with the particular quality of stillness she had always found in him, the inhabited silence of a man whose interior life was very full and very quiet at the same time. He turned and found her looking at him. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Fences," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "And wheat," she said, "and a palomino horse in a golden evening, and a man who showed up on the other side of my fence and fixed the part I could not reach." "That is a very accurate summary of how we started," he said. "Yes," she said, "and look where we ended up." He reached across and took her hand, his thumb moving across her knuckles in the way he had always done, the small habitual gesture she would have missed like missing a piece of herself. "Not ended," he said. "Continuing." "Yes," she said, "continuing." Outside, the December wind was moving across the Kansas plains, bending the dry grass and rattling the bare branches of the cottonwoods along Cimarron Creek. Inside, the fire burned steady in the stove, and Harold turned a page in his book, and Margaret slept with the absolute abandon of a child who has never doubted for a single moment that she is safe and loved. And in the spring the orchard would bloom and the wheat would begin, and prairie gold would move in the morning light like something the land itself had made. And Cole Harding, who had ridden into this part of Kansas on a rented place with a prize horse and a quiet manner and more love in him than he had ever known how to say out loud, sat beside his wife in the house that had become the most important place in the world to him, and he held her hand, and he was exactly where he intended to stay. He had sold his most precious possession for a woman he barely knew, a woman he had watched through a fence line with careful, wondering eyes, a woman who had told him her whole truth in the dusk of an October evening, with the creek whispering behind them. He had done it without announcement or expectation. He had never asked for recognition, and he had never needed it, because the thing he had gotten in return was not something he would have traded back for anything in any world. The farm was hers and his together now. The debt was paid and long forgotten. The letter from the bank that had started everything was tucked in the same floorboard where her father had kept his important things, and she had put it there on purpose, so the land would remember what it had nearly lost and what it had found instead. Outside the window, the Kansas stars were doing their reliable and magnificent work, spreading themselves across the December sky with the total indifference to human affairs that makes them, paradoxically, one of the most human things to look at, because they make you feel the scale of what you have, the smallness of a lamp and a house and 2 people and 2 sleeping children, and also the absoluteness of it, the fact that it is everything. It is precisely everything. And there is nothing beyond it that matters more. Elara Voss Harding looked at her husband in the firelight. She thought of fences repaired together and wheat carried in, and a horse that had saved a farm without ever knowing it had saved something larger, the life that grew up inside the saving, the love that had been there from the very first quiet, attentive morning, waiting only for the right moment to declare itself. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. And the fire burned and the wind moved and the stars kept their watch and the farm held steady in the dark, the way good things hold, not because nothing threatens them, but because what is rooted does not easily fall.